A shelter dog gives birth to a strange puppy, and the staff freeze when this happens. At first, it looks like a fragile newborn fighting for life. But then, something doesn't add up. The puppy carries bizarre markings that no one can explain, and before the night is over, someone is already pounding on the door, demanding the litter by name. What secret could a tiny newborn possibly hold that makes strangers desperate to take him away? Why would those in power risk everything to keep the truth hidden? And when danger closes in, who will have the courage to protect a helpless life? One strange birth sparks a battle far bigger than anyone imagined, and the answer will change everything. So the question is, what is this puppy really worth, and how far will people go to get it? I'd love to know. Where are you watching from? Type it down below, and while you're here, subscribe so you'll always catch the next story. The fluorescent lights hummed steadily overhead as Greer Halston made her way through the quiet corridors of the county animal shelter. The night shift suited her. Peaceful hours when she could focus on the animals without the usual daytime chaos. Her footsteps echoed softly against the concrete floor as she completed her regular rounds, checking on each occupant with careful attention. Tonight felt different, though. The autumn rain drummed against the metal roof, creating a symphony that seemed to match Greer's heightened awareness. Something in the air felt charged, expectant. Her radio crackled to life. "Greer, we've got an intake at the receiving bay. Pregnant stray, looks pretty far along." "On my way," she responded, already turning towards the shelter's rear entrance. Her heart picked up pace. Pregnant intakes always needed special care. The receiving area's harsh lights illuminated a medium-sized dog huddled in the corner of a transport crate. Despite her obvious fear, the dog's amber eyes held a gentle intelligence that immediately caught Greer's attention. Her coat was ragged and matted in places, telling a story of neglect, but there was something dignified about the way she held herself. "Hey there, sweet girl," Greer crooned softly, kneeling beside the crate. "Let's get you somewhere more comfortable." She noticed the dog's swollen belly and the way she was breathing. "You look like you might be ready to meet those babies soon." Moving with practiced efficiency, Greer prepared a quiet kennel in the medical wing. She lined it with soft blankets and placed fresh water within easy reach. The nameplate on the door remained blank. All new intakes needed proper processing first. Back at the receiving area, Greer approached the crate slowly, speaking in soothing tones. "It's okay, Mama. We're going to take good care of you." To her surprise, the dog's tail gave a slight wag. Despite her obvious anxiety, something about Greer seemed to put her at ease. As Greer began the intake process, she felt drawn to this gentle creature. "I think we'll call you Juniper," she said softly, logging the name into the shelter's database. "It suits you. Strong but sweet." Juniper allowed Greer to guide her to the prepared kennel, her movements becoming increasingly labored. Once inside, she immediately began circling and pawing at the blankets. "That's it, girl. Make yourself comfortable." Greer noticed the intensity of Juniper's breathing. "I think those puppies might be making their appearance sooner rather than later." She settled in nearby with her laptop, determined to keep watch while completing the intake paperwork. The shelter's software prompted her through the standard fields: approximate age, breed mix possibilities, physical condition, and behavioral notes. Just as Greer was finishing the initial entry, Juniper let out a low whine. The dog's body tensed, and Greer recognized the signs immediately. "Okay, sweet girl, here we go." The next hour passed in a blur of focused activity. Greer moved with quiet efficiency, providing comfort while giving Juniper space to follow her instincts. The first contractions came steady and strong. "You're doing great, Juniper," Greer encouraged, keeping her voice calm despite her growing excitement. This was always a special moment. New life coming into the world, even in the sterile confines of a shelter kennel. The first puppy arrived without complication, but as Juniper delivered her second, Greer's heart nearly stopped. Something was different about this one. Very different. The puppy appeared unusually large for a newborn, with distinct facial features unlike anything Greer had seen before. Its muzzle was shorter, almost flat, and its eyes seemed larger, set wider apart than normal. The coloring was odd, too, a silvery sheen that seemed to shimmer even under the fluorescent lights. But most alarming was the puppy's struggle to breathe. Its chest heaved with desperate effort, making barely audible squeaking sounds. Greer's training kicked in. Without hesitation, she reached for the newborn, her hands steady despite her racing heart. "Come on, little one," she whispered, carefully clearing its airways and gently massaging its chest. Seconds stretched like hours as she worked, her focus absolute. Finally, the puppy gave a stronger squeak, then a real cry. Its breathing, while still labored, became more regular. "That's it," Greer breathed, relief flooding through her. She carefully placed the pup back with Juniper, who immediately began cleaning it with gentle determination. The commotion had drawn attention. 2 other night staff members stood in the doorway, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. "What is that thing?" one of them whispered, taking a step back. Before Greer could respond, a sharp ping came from her laptop. The shelter's software had automatically flagged Juniper's kennel with a code she'd never seen before. Y7. A pop-up window flashed Rare Litter Alert in bold red letters. "What the—" Greer began, but was cut off by a loud pounding at the shelter's front entrance. Through the security camera feed on her laptop, she could see a man in a dark jacket with "Transport" emblazoned across the back. His fist hammered against the glass again. "Open up!" his voice carried through the building. "I'm here for the Y7 litter, now!" Greer's protective instincts flared. How could anyone know about this litter so quickly? The pup had been born less than 5 minutes ago. The pounding continued, more insistent now. "That's shelter property. You need to release it immediately." Juniper pressed closer to her puppies, her gentle eyes now sharp with maternal concern. The strange pup made another squeaking sound, still struggling but fighting to live. Greer positioned herself between the kennel and the door, her mind racing. The man's demand made no sense. Standard transport protocols were never this urgent, and certainly not in the middle of the night. Something was very wrong. Her co-workers shifted uncomfortably, looking between Greer and the front entrance. The pounding continued, punctuated by increasingly aggressive demands. "Should we?" one of them started. "No," Greer said firmly, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "Something's not right here. That puppy nearly died moments ago. It needs stabilization and monitoring. Nobody's taking these dogs anywhere right now." The strange pup squeaked again, pressing closer to its mother. Juniper's tail curled protectively around her litter, her trust in Greer evident in the way she maintained eye contact. The shelter's phone began to ring, its shrill tone cutting through the tension. On the security feed, the man in the transport jacket had pulled out a cell phone, his angry gestures visible even through the grainy footage. Greer took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. In all her years of shelter work, she'd never encountered anything like this. But looking at Juniper and her vulnerable puppies, she knew one thing for certain. Her quiet night shift had just become the front line of something much bigger than herself. The pounding at the door continued, a desperate rhythm that seemed to echo the racing of Greer's heart. But she stood her ground, her years of working with vulnerable animals having taught her to trust her instincts. And right now, every instinct was screaming that this situation was dangerous. Through the kennel bars, Juniper nuzzled her unusual puppy, her maternal devotion obvious despite the pup's strange appearance. The other staff members had backed away, but Greer remained, her presence a steadfast barrier between the vulnerable family and whatever threat waited at the front door. The phone kept ringing, and the man kept pounding, but Greer's focus remained on the tiny life she'd just helped save. Whatever was happening, whatever this mysterious Y7 code meant, she knew she'd made the right choice. Sometimes the quietest people make the loudest stands, and tonight, in this moment, Greer Holston had found her voice. The rhythmic pounding at the front door continued as Greer knelt beside Juniper's kennel, her attention divided between monitoring the newborn pup's breathing and watching the security feed on her laptop. The man in the transport jacket had stopped his assault on the main entrance and was now moving along the building's perimeter, testing each door and window with determined focus. Greer's hands trembled slightly as she checked the puppy's vital signs. Its breathing had stabilized somewhat, but it still needed careful observation. Juniper pressed against the kennel bars, her warm breath ghosting over Greer's wrist as she worked. "Everything's okay, girl," Greer murmured, though her own heart was racing. "I won't let anything happen to you or your babies." The sound of heels clicking against linoleum echoed through the corridor, growing louder with each step. Greer looked up to see Darla Pennington striding toward them, her designer blazer somehow unwrinkled despite the late hour. The shelter director's perfectly maintained appearance seemed out of place in the utilitarian surroundings. "Greer, dear," Darla said, her voice carrying a practiced warmth that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I came as soon as I heard about our special delivery." The other night staff members stepped back, making way for their boss. Darla approached the kennel, maintaining what appeared to be casual interest, but Greer noticed how the director's gaze fixed immediately on the unusual puppy. "We have a partner rescue ready to take this family," Darla announced, sliding her manicured fingers through her short, precise haircut. "They specialize in complicated cases like this." Greer stood slowly, positioning herself more firmly between Darla and the kennel. "With all due respect, Ms. Pennington, this puppy nearly died minutes ago. It needs monitoring and stabilization before any transport can be considered." "I appreciate your concern," Darla said, her smile tightening at the edges. "But I've already authorized the transfer. The paperwork is being processed as we speak." As Darla spoke, Greer's attention was caught by something she hadn't noticed in the chaos of the birth. A small, precise notch in the newborn puppy's ear. The cut was clean, deliberate, and instantly familiar. Growing up in rural Missouri, she'd spent years in 4-H clubs, where livestock were marked with similar notches in specific patterns to identify ownership and breeding lines. This wasn't a birth defect or injury. This was a code. The realization sent a chill down her spine as pieces began falling into place. The immediate alert, the transport man's urgent demands, Darla's unusual late-night appearance. None of this followed normal shelter protocols. "The puppy's not stable enough to move," Greer insisted, her voice firmer now. "Standard medical protocol requires at least 24 hours of observation after a difficult birth." Darla's careful mask slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of something hard and cold beneath. "This isn't a request, Greer. The transfer has been approved. Step aside." Through the window, Greer could see the transport man making another circuit of the building. His movements were becoming more agitated, more desperate. Whatever was happening, he clearly had a deadline to meet. Juniper whined softly, drawing Greer's attention back to the kennel. The mother dog had gathered her puppies closer, her body curved protectively around them. The strange pup nuzzled against her, still making occasional squeaking sounds that tugged at Greer's heart. "I can't do that," Greer said quietly, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "Not without proper medical clearance and standard documentation. It's against shelter policy." Darla's perfectly plucked eyebrows arched. "Are you refusing a direct order from your supervisor?" "I'm following established medical protocols," Greer corrected, her quiet determination growing stronger. "Any transport requires a full health check and proper paperwork. Those are the rules you established yourself, Miss Pennington." The other staff members shifted uncomfortably, but Greer noticed they were listening intently. Seeds of doubt were being planted. Why was their director so eager to break her own protocols? "The rules can be flexible in special circumstances," Darla said, her tone becoming less friendly. "This is a unique situation that requires immediate action." "What makes it so unique?" Greer asked, gesturing to her laptop. "The system flagged this as a rare litter alert with a Y7 code I've never seen before. and somehow a transport driver knew about it instantly? That doesn't make sense. Darla's smile became razor-sharp. You're overthinking this, dear. Just step aside and let us handle it. Us? Greer repeated softly. The director's expression froze for a fraction of a second, a tell that confirmed Greer's growing suspicions. There was more going on here than a simple rescue transfer. Outside, the transport man had completed another circuit of the building. He stood at the back door now, his phone pressed to his ear, gesturing animatedly. Through the security feed, Greer could see his mouth moving rapidly, clearly arguing with someone. The strange puppy squeaked again, drawing everyone's attention. Its unusual features seemed even more pronounced now, marking it as something rare and valuable. No longer just a medical curiosity, it had become a target, something people were willing to break rules and protocols to obtain. Greer thought about the notch in its ear, that deliberate mark that spoke of ownership and control. Someone had tagged this puppy before it was even born, which meant Juniper's appearance at the shelter wasn't as random as it had seemed. I'll need to see the transfer paperwork, Greer said, her voice quiet but firm. And we'll need a licensed vet to clear the puppy for transport. Until then, they stay here under observation. Darla's careful mask cracked further, real anger seeping through. You're making a mistake, Greer. Don't let misplaced concern for one litter jeopardize your position here. The threat was clear, but Greer stood her ground. Years of working the quiet night shift, of being overlooked and underestimated, had prepared her for this moment. She might appear timid, but when it came to protecting vulnerable animals in her care, she was immovable. I'm following proper procedures, she repeated. Nothing leaves this shelter without proper documentation and medical clearance. That's not negotiable. The other staff members were watching the exchange with growing interest, their earlier discomfort giving way to curiosity. Darla seemed to notice their attention, her expression smoothing back into practiced pleasantness. We'll discuss this further in my office, the director said, her tone carrying a warning. For now, continue monitoring the litter, but understand this matter isn't settled. Greer nodded, maintaining her position by the kennel. I'll document everything carefully, as per shelter protocols. Darla turned sharply on her heel and strode away, her phone already in hand. Through the windows, the transport man could be seen pacing, his agitation visible even from a distance. Juniper pressed her nose against Greer's hand through the kennel bars, her touch warm and trusting. The strange puppy had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, its breathing steadier now, but still requiring careful observation. Greer's co-workers lingered for a moment longer before drifting back to their duties, throwing curious glances over their shoulders. Something had shifted in the atmosphere. Questions had been raised that couldn't be easily dismissed. As Greer settled in to monitor her charges, she knew she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Her quiet resistance had planted seeds of doubt about Darla's intentions, and those seeds would grow. The notch in the puppy's ear was more than a mark. It was evidence that something darker was happening behind the shelter's legitimate operations. The transport man's shadow passed by the window again, a reminder that whatever forces were at work here wouldn't give up easily. The strange puppy and its mother had become the center of something much larger and more dangerous than a simple rescue transfer. But Greer remained steady in her vigil, her presence a barrier between the vulnerable family and those who sought to claim them. Sometimes the quietest acts of defiance could spark the biggest changes. And tonight, in this sterile shelter corridor, she had lit a flame that would not be easily extinguished. With trembling fingers, Greer pulled her old flip phone from her scrub's pocket and retreated to the shelter's dimly lit break room. The strange notch in the newborn puppy's ear kept flashing in her mind, too precise to be random. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she needed, Deputy Keaton Royce from Animal Crimes. Her thumb hovered over the call button as doubt crept in. What if she was overreacting? But then she remembered the transport man's aggressive demands and Darla's too smooth assurances. Taking a deep breath, She pressed call. The phone rang 3 times before a gravelly voice answered, "Deputy Royce." "Deputy, this is Greer Hulston from County Animal Shelter," she said quietly, glancing at the break room door. "I'm sorry to call so late, but something's not right here." There was a pause, then recognition in his voice. "Greer, the night shift tech who writes the detailed intake reports?" "Yes, sir. We have a situation with a pregnant stray that just gave birth. There's something odd about one of the puppies, and people are already trying to take them." The words tumbled out as Greer described the strange-looking newborn, the precise ear notch, and the immediate demands for transfer. Keaton's voice sharpened with interest. "Did you say a notched ear? Can you describe the mark exactly?" Greer closed her eyes, picturing it. Clean V-shape on the right ear, about 1/8 of an inch deep, like the notches they use to mark show animals, but smaller. "Listen carefully," Keaton said, his tone deadly serious. "That notch matches the marking system used by Harlan Voss. He's a major player in designer dog breeding operations, but we've never been able to prove it. He launders purebred dogs through fake rescues, selling them as rare designer mixes for thousands." Greer's stomach dropped. The shelter software flagged this litter as rare automatically, and the transport man knew the exact kennel code. "That's his system," Keaton confirmed. "He plants people in shelters to watch for specific breeds, then moves them through shell rescue organizations. That puppy could be proof of his engineered inbreeding program." He paused. "Can you keep them safe until I get there?" "I'm about 40 minutes out." "I'll try," Greer promised, though her voice shook slightly. "How dangerous is this Voss person?" "Don't confront anyone," Keaton warned. "He's ruthless when his operation is threatened. I'll come as fast as I can, but be careful." After hanging up, Greer leaned against the break room wall, her mind racing. She needed help, someone she could trust. The image of Nico Barfield came to mind. The stocky kennel aide wasn't the most sophisticated person, but his heart was pure gold when it came to the animals. She found him in the dog wing, carefully cleaning kennels even though his shift had technically ended. "Nico, I need your help," she whispered, pulling him aside. "It's about Juniper and her puppies." Nico's broad face creased with concern as she explained the situation. He didn't understand all the technical details about genetic engineering, but he got the important part. Someone wanted to hurt the dogs. "Ain't nobody taking those pups while I'm here," he declared, squaring his shoulders. "What do you need me to do?" "We need to move them somewhere safer," Greer said. "The isolation room in the back has a separate lock, and hardly anyone uses it. Will you help me?" "You bet," Nico said without hesitation. "Let me grab the transport carrier from storage." They worked quickly but carefully. Nico kept watch while Greer gently lifted Juniper and her newborns into the padded carrier. The mother dog trembled but didn't resist, seeming to sense Greer's protective intentions. The strange-looking puppy made tiny squeaking sounds as Greer nestled it close to its siblings. The isolation room was small but clean, with solid walls instead of chain-link kennels. Most importantly, it had a heavy door with its own deadbolt. Greer arranged fresh blankets in a corner while Nico filled water bowls and checked the locks twice. "I'll stay here with them," Nico offered, settling onto a stack of towels. "Got my phone if you need me. Nobody's getting past this door without going through me first." Greer squeezed his shoulder gratefully. "Thank you, Nico. Deputy Royce should be here soon. Just be careful, okay? These people sound dangerous." "Don't you worry about me," Nico said with a determined smile. "Had plenty of practice dealing with mean dogs in my time here. Mean people ain't so different." As Greer left to check on her other duties, she felt a complex mix of emotions. Fear still churned in her stomach, but it was tempered now by something stronger: resolve. For the first time in her career, she was choosing to actively fight against something wrong, instead of just quietly documenting it. She thought of all the detailed notes she'd taken over the years, cataloguing injuries and suspicious circumstances that no one else seemed to notice or care about. Maybe this was why she'd been so thorough all along, preparing for a moment when those details would finally matter. The weight of her decision pressed on her shoulders, but it felt right. Juniper and her puppies needed protection, and sometimes protecting the vulnerable meant standing up to the powerful. With Nico's steady presence guarding the isolation room and Deputy Royce on the way, she had hope they could hold out long enough to expose whatever was really going on. Every few minutes, Greer found excuses to patrol past the isolation room, exchanging quick nods with Nico through the window. She kept her movements casual, trying not to draw attention to the fact that Juniper and her litter were no longer in their original kennel. But her nerves jangled every time she heard footsteps or voices, wondering if the transport man had found another way in. Through it all, she kept thinking about the strange puppy with its precisely notched ear. If Deputy Royce was right, that tiny marking was evidence of something much darker, a system that treated living creatures as products to be branded and sold. The thought made her hands clench into fists. No matter what happened next, she knew she'd made the right choice in reaching out for help. Time seemed to crawl as they waited for Keaton to arrive. Greer busied herself with routine tasks, measuring medications, updating charts, checking on the other animals. But her attention never strayed far from the isolation room where Juniper and her precious cargo lay hidden. Every passing minute brought equal measures of anxiety and determination. She had chosen her path now, chosen courage over compliance, protection over protocol. There was no going back. The security cameras showed the transport man still prowling the parking lot, occasionally testing doors and peering through windows. His persistent presence confirmed Greer's suspicions that this was no ordinary rescue transfer. Legitimate transporters didn't lurk in shadows or demand immediate handover of newborn puppies. Nico remained steadfast at his post, texting brief updates to Greer's phone. All quiet here. Mama and pups sleeping, still secure. His simple messages were deeply reassuring, proof that she wasn't facing this alone anymore. Each minute that ticked by was another small victory, another moment keeping Juniper's litter safe from whatever fate Harlan Voss had planned for them. Greer silently urged Deputy Royce to hurry, while steeling herself for whatever might come next. The night was far from over, but she had found her courage and her allies. Sometimes that was all you needed to start changing things for the better. Night settled over the county shelter like a heavy blanket, bringing with it an uneasy stillness that made Greer's skin prickle. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she made her rounds, checking each kennel with extra care. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every unexpected sound made her jump. "Everything okay down there?" Nico called from the other end of the corridor, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "So far," Greer answered, but her stomach was in knots. They had moved Juniper and her pups to the isolation room hours ago, but it felt like a temporary solution at best. The mother dog lay curled protectively around her unusual litter, amber eyes following Greer's every movement. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and rain began to patter against the metal roof. Greer pulled her thin shelter jacket tighter around her shoulders. The storm matched her mood, dark and threatening. "I don't like this," Nico said, joining her at the isolation room window. His normally cheerful face was creased with worry. "That transport guy's van is still out there. I've seen it circle the block 3 times now." Greer peered through the rain-streaked window. Sure enough, a white van with faded lettering crept past the shelter again, moving slowly despite the worsening weather. "They're watching us," she murmured, "waiting for something." A crash from the back of the building made them both jump. Then came the unmistakable sound of multiple dogs barking in distress. The outdoor kennels. Greer's heart leaped into her throat. She broke into a run, with Nico right behind her. The barking grew more frantic as they approached the back door. When they burst outside into the rain, Greer's worst fears were confirmed. The chain-link fence that enclosed the exercise yard had been cut clean through. Several dogs were already racing towards the gap, drawn by the promise of freedom and the road beyond. "No!" Greer sprinted toward the rolling gate at the far end of the lot. Rain plastered her hair to her face as she ran, her shoes slipping in the mud. Headlights suddenly swept across the yard. The white van was approaching fast. Without thinking about her own safety, Greer threw herself against the heavy metal gate. Her shoulder screamed in protest as she used her body weight to push it closed. A German Shepherd mix darted past her, but Nico was there in an instant, grabbing the dog's collar and pulling him back. The van's engine roared as it accelerated toward them. Greer's heart pounded as the headlights grew brighter, temporarily blinding her. For a terrible moment, she wasn't sure if the driver would stop. At the last second, the van swerved, spraying mud and gravel. Greer pressed herself flat against the gate, feeling the wind of its passage. The vehicle fishtailed on the wet pavement before speeding away into the night. "Greer!" Nico's voice was panicked. "Are you okay?" She couldn't answer right away, her breath coming in short gasps. The reality of how close she'd come to being hit struck her hard. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to stay upright, keeping pressure on the gate while Nico secured it with a length of chain from the maintenance shed. Together, they worked to round up the escaped dogs, getting soaked to the skin in the process. The German Shepherd was still trembling as they led him back inside. Other dogs paced their kennels nervously, upset by the commotion. "That wasn't an accident," Greer said finally, wringing water from her ponytail. "Someone cut that fence deliberately. They were trying to create a distraction." Nico nodded grimly. "So they could get to Juniper's pups while we were dealing with the chaos." He ran a hand over his buzz cut, scattering water droplets. "They could have killed you with that van, Greer. These people mean business." The truth of his words hit her hard. This wasn't just about protecting a litter of puppies anymore. Whoever wanted these dogs was willing to risk human life to get them. The image of the notched ear flashed in her mind again, along with Deputy Royce's warnings about Harlan Voss and his operation. "We need to check on Juniper," Greer said, already moving toward the isolation room. Her wet shoes squeaked on the floor with each step, leaving muddy tracks behind. The mother dog lifted her head as they entered, still guarding her puppies closely. "She's okay," Nico assured her, but Greer had to count each tiny body herself before she could relax even slightly. 6 puppies, all accounted for, including the strange one that had started all this. Greer sank onto the floor beside Juniper's bed, not caring that she was soaking wet and shivering. The mother dog shifted closer, offering warmth and comfort. Looking into those trusting amber eyes, Greer felt her resolve strengthen. These dogs had no one else to protect them. "I'm not letting them take you," she whispered to Juniper, gently scratching behind the dog's ears. "No matter what they try." Nico sat down beside her, his solid presence reassuring. "We should call Deputy Royce," he suggested. "Tell him what happened. Maybe he can get someone out here to watch the place." Greer nodded, but she knew how stretched thin the Animal Crimes Unit was. Even if Keaton wanted to help, he might not have the resources. They were largely on their own. "We need to figure out someplace safer for them," she said, watching the puppies nurse. "Somewhere they won't think to look." The isolation room suddenly felt very exposed, despite its locked door and lack of windows. "I might know a place," Nico said slowly. "My sister has an old barn on her property. Nobody uses it anymore, but it's solid. Out of the way, too." Hope flickered in Greer's chest, but she hesitated. Moving them would be risky. The puppies are so young, and Juniper's still recovering from the birth. "Staying here might be riskier," Nico pointed out. "These people aren't going to give up. Next time they might do worse than cut a fence." He was right, and Greer knew it. The near miss with the van had shown just how far their opponents would go. She could still feel the rush of air as it passed, hear the squeal of tires on wet pavement. Her shoulder ached where she'd thrown herself against the gate, and her uniform was covered in mud. "We'll need to be careful," she said finally. "Plan it out properly. Make sure we have everything we need to keep them warm and fed. Her mind was already racing through the logistics. Blankets, puppy formula in case Juniper's milk production was affected by stress, basic medical supplies. Nico squeezed her shoulder gently. We'll figure it out. But first, you should probably change into something dry before you catch pneumonia. Greer managed a weak smile, but her eyes stayed fixed on Juniper and her pups. The mother dog had dozed off, confident in their presence. Such trust made Greer's heart ache. She wouldn't let that trust be betrayed. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the isolation room, there was a pocket of calm. Greer knew it was temporary. Soon they would have to face more challenges, make more difficult decisions. But for now, she allowed herself to take comfort in the simple sound of puppies breathing, in Juniper's steady presence, in Nico's unwavering support. Her brush with death had done more than frighten her. It had crystallized her determination. This wasn't just about doing her job anymore. It wasn't even just about following her conscience. This was personal now. Whatever came next, she would face it. These dogs needed her, and she wouldn't let them down. Thunder cracked overhead, making the building shudder. Juniper stirred briefly, but settled again when Greer stroked her head. In that moment, Greer made a silent promise to both the mother dog and her unusual litter. She would protect them, no matter the cost. The night stretched ahead, full of uncertainty, but Greer's path was clear. She had chosen her side in this fight, and there was no turning back now. Dawn crept through the shelter windows, casting long shadows across the isolation room floor. Greer hadn't slept, her body still humming with adrenaline from the night's events. The mother dog, Juniper, dozed fitfully, her puppies nestled close. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a heavy silence broken only by soft puppy whimpers and the gentle hum of the heating system. Nico had gone to check on the other animals and assess the damage from the fence incident, leaving Greer alone with her charges. She took advantage of the quiet moment to examine the unusual puppy more closely. Something about its features had been nagging at her mind, like a half-remembered lesson from her 4-H days. Carefully, she lifted the pup from its spot against Juniper's warm belly. The mother dog raised her head, watching intently, but trusting enough to allow the handling. The puppy squirmed in Greer's gentle grip, already stronger than it had been at birth. "Let's get a good look at you, little one," she murmured, cradling it close to the overhead light. The pup's coat was darker than its siblings, with distinctive markings that didn't quite match any standard breed pattern she knew, but it was the other details that made her breath catch. First, there were the dew claws, not just the usual single ones, but doubles on each rear leg. Greer had seen this trait before in certain European herding breeds, but it was rare. Then there was the nose, slightly split down the middle in a way that reminded her of certain Asian breeds. The tongue, when the puppy yawned, showed a bluish tint that was definitely not typical, but it was the ear that made everything click into place. The small notch she'd noticed earlier wasn't random damage, it followed a precise pattern. In her years showing livestock, she'd learned to recognize various breeder marking systems. This one was deliberate, a code meant to track bloodlines and breeding pairs. "Oh my God!" she whispered, pieces falling into place. The puppy wasn't just unusual, it was engineered. Someone had deliberately crossed specific breeds to create these traits. And not just any breeds, she could see it now. The size and structure suggested Beauceron, a French herding dog known for double dew claws. The bluish tongue and some of the facial features screamed Chow Chow influence. Both breeds were relatively rare in the United States. Both commanded high prices from the right buyers, and both required extensive knowledge and resources to breed properly. This wasn't a random shelter puppy. It was a product of careful calculation. Greer's hands shook slightly as she settled the pup back with its mother. Deputy Royce's warnings about Harlan Voss rang in her ears. The notorious breeder who laundered dogs through rescue networks, creating designer crosses that could sell for thousands of dollars. This puppy was proof of his operation. And Darla, the shelter director's insistence on transferring the litter suddenly made horrible sense. She wasn't trying to help these dogs, she was part of the scheme. The shelter's system, the mysterious Y7 code, the immediate attempt to remove the litter, it was all connected. Greer pulled out her phone and started documenting everything. She photographed each of the puppy's distinctive features, paying special attention to the ear notch. Her fingers flew across the screen as she made detailed notes, drawing on her animal science background to explain the significance of each trait. Her mind raced back through other recent intakes, wondering how many other dogs had passed through with similar markings. How long had this been going on? How many people at the shelter knew? The scope of the operation must be massive to justify the risk and violence they'd shown last night. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her quickly pocket her phone. Nico appeared in the doorway, looking tired but determined. "Fence is temporarily secured," he reported, "but you need to see this. Found something interesting in the parking lot." Greer glanced at Juniper, reluctant to leave. The mother dog lifted her head and gave a soft woof, as if granting permission. After making sure the puppies were securely nestled, Greer followed Nico outside. The morning air was crisp and clean after the storm. Nico led her to a spot near where the van had nearly hit her. There, half buried in mud, was a leather wallet. The impact of her dive must have knocked it from someone's pocket. "Look at this," Nico said, carefully opening it. Inside was a business card for Elite Heritage Rescues with a familiar name, Harlan Voss, Director of Operations. "There's more," Nico continued, pulling out a folded paper. It was a breeding chart, filled with codes and crosses. Some of the combinations matched exactly what Greer had observed in the unusual puppy. "This isn't just about one litter," Greer said quietly. "They're running an entire operation through the shelter system. Darla's been helping them hide it in plain sight." Nico nodded grimly. "Question is, what do we do now?" "This is bigger than just keeping one litter safe." Greer looked back at the shelter building, thinking of all the animals that had passed through its doors. How many had been part of this scheme? How many more would be if they didn't stop it? "We document everything," she said firmly. "Every detail about this puppy, every piece of evidence we can find. Deputy Royce needs to see all of it." She paused, considering their next steps carefully. "But first, we need to move Juniper and the puppies. They're not safe here anymore." "My sister's barn?" Nico suggested again. Greer nodded. "As soon as it's dark." "We'll need to be careful. They'll be watching the shelter now that they know we're onto something." They spent the next few hours gathering supplies and making plans, all while maintaining their regular duties to avoid suspicion. Greer kept detailed notes about the puppy's unique traits, photographing everything she could think of that might be relevant. Each new observation reinforced her certainty about what they'd stumbled into. The unusual pup wasn't just special, it was evidence. Evidence of a carefully orchestrated breeding program designed to create expensive designer dogs while exploiting the shelter system's legitimacy as cover. The notched ear wasn't a flaw but a signature, marking the puppy as part of a larger criminal enterprise. As she worked, Greer's initial fear began to transform into determination. These people had built their operation on the trust of people who genuinely wanted to help animals. They'd corrupted a system meant to protect the vulnerable, and they'd shown they were willing to use violence to protect their scheme. But now they'd made a mistake. They'd left behind evidence, in the form of one very special puppy and the documents that proved its origins. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And Greer was determined to use it to expose the truth, no matter what it took. She looked down at the unusual puppy, now sleeping peacefully against its mother. "You're not just different," she whispered. "You're proof. And we're going to make sure everyone knows what that means." The early morning sun cast long shadows through the shelter windows as Greer sat across from Deputy Keaton Royce in his cramped office. Coffee cups and scattered papers covered his desk, evidence of their hours of planning. The wall clock ticked steadily, marking each precious moment they had left to act. "If we control where the transfer happens," Keaton said, tapping his weathered notepad, We can catch them red-handed. The loading dock behind the old feed store would be perfect. Plenty of cover for our team, only one way in and out. Greer nodded, her tired eyes bright with determination. Darla won't suspect anything if I tell her I found a quiet spot for the handoff. She's been pushing hard for that transfer paperwork. Remember, we need clear evidence of the transaction. Get her to confirm the details in writing if you can. Keaton's face was etched with concern. But be careful, Greer. People like this, they can turn dangerous when cornered. Back at the shelter, Greer kept her movements deliberately casual as she approached Darla's office. Her heart pounded, but her hands remained steady as she knocked on the door. "Come in," Darla called, her voice carrying that artificial sweetness that made Greer's skin crawl. The shelter director sat behind her imposing desk, perfectly coiffed as always. Her manicured nails clicked against her keyboard as she looked up, eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of Greer. "I found a good spot for the transfer," Greer said, keeping her voice neutral. "The old feed store loading dock. It's private, easy access." Something shifted in Darla's expression, a flicker of suspicion that made Greer's stomach tighten. The older woman's smile didn't reach her eyes as she stood, smoothing her designer blazer. "That won't be necessary anymore," Darla said coldly. "In fact, I've been meaning to discuss your recent behavior. Your unauthorized decisions regarding shelter property, your insubordination." She pulled a folder from her desk drawer. "I'm placing you on immediate suspension, pending review. Your access codes will be revoked effective immediately." The words hit Greer like a physical blow. She had known this might happen, but the reality still stung. "Those animals aren't property," she said quietly. "They deserve better than being traded like commodities." "Turn in your badge and keys," Darla snapped. "Security will escort you out." Walking through the shelter doors felt like leaving part of herself behind. Greer's mind raced. Without access, how could she protect Juniper and her puppies? How could she gather the evidence they desperately needed? That evening, she sat in her car in the shelter parking lot, watching the sun sink behind the buildings. A tap on her window made her jump. She turned to see Margot Bixby, the night janitor, standing there with her cleaning cart. "You look like you could use some help," Margot said gruffly when Greer rolled down the window. The older woman's grey hair was pulled back in its usual tight bun, her stooped shoulders somehow still conveying strength. "I don't know what to do," Greer admitted. "They've locked me out completely." Margot's sharp eyes studied her face. "You're trying to stop them selling those dogs through the back door, aren't you?" "Been watching that game for years myself." She glanced around the empty lot. "Meet me behind the building in 10 minutes. Might have something you need to see." True to her word, Margot appeared with a cardboard box of old records, intake logs, breeding documentation, and rolls of microfilm that had been overlooked when the shelter digitized their systems. "Used to clerk at livestock auctions," Margot explained as she handed over the box. "Recognized those ear notches right away. Breeders have been using codes like that for decades, marking bloodlines, tracking traits. Most folks nowadays don't know how to read them anymore." Greer's hands trembled as she lifted out the first logbook. "This could be exactly what we need." "But why help me?" Margot's weathered face softened slightly. "Because in 30 years of cleaning this place, you're the first person I've seen who cares more about the animals than the politics. Don't waste it." For the next several days, Greer worked tirelessly at her kitchen table, cross-referencing her detailed notes with the old records. Patterns began to emerge. The ear notches weren't random. They marked specific genetic traits, breeding pairs, and sales routes. Combined with the shelter's intake records, they revealed a complex network of manufactured designer breeds moving through multiple facilities. She created careful diagrams, matching Voss's marking system to known puppy sales. The strange features of Juniper's puppy, the double dew claws, the distinctive nose shape, were deliberately engineered traits, proof of his illegal breeding operation. Late one night, her phone buzzed with a text from Deputy Keaton. "Need to see this. Bringing coffee." 20 minutes later, they hunched over her kitchen table, surrounded by papers and empty coffee cups. Keaton's eyes widened as she walked him through her findings. "This is incredible," he said, examining her diagrams. "The ear notches match perfectly with known Voss property sales. And these intake patterns?" He shook his head in admiration. "You've mapped out their whole operation." "Not just Voss," Greer said quietly. "Look at these transfer authorizations. Darla's signature is on every one. She's been helping him launder these dogs through the shelter system for years." Keaton's face hardened as he studied the documents. This is exactly what we needed. Concrete evidence linking them both to the breeding operation. He gathered the papers carefully. "We'll need to move fast before they realize what we have." Greer thought of Juniper and her puppies, still hidden in the shelter's isolation room. Will it be enough? With this documentation? Absolutely. Keaton's tired face broke into a smile. "You did it, Greer. You found the missing pieces we needed." She felt tears prick at her eyes, tears of relief, exhaustion, and determination. The truth was finally coming to light, thanks to an unlikely alliance with a gruff janitor who had seen more than anyone suspected. "What happens next?" she asked, straightening the scattered papers with trembling hands. "Now we build our case properly," Keaton said, his voice firm with resolve. "Every I dotted, every T crossed. They won't wriggle out of this one." He started organizing the documents into neat piles. "And Greer, the department owes you one hell of a thank you." She shook her head. "I just want the animals to be safe. That's all I've ever wanted. Sometimes the simplest motivations make the strongest cases." He replied, "Get some rest. Tomorrow we start putting all these pieces together officially." As Keaton left with the evidence carefully boxed and documented, Greer stood at her window, watching the night sky. Somewhere in the shelter, Juniper was curled around her puppies, not knowing she had become the catalyst for exposing years of corruption. Thanks to Margot's unexpected help and those overlooked records, they finally had a chance to end the cruel breeding operation once and for all. The early morning mist clung to the shelter's parking lot like a thin blanket, creating ghostly shapes in the dim light. Greer crouched behind a parked maintenance truck, her heart pounding against her ribs. Deputy Keaton knelt beside her, his weathered face focused as he adjusted the small recording device in his hand. The trap they had carefully planned was finally ready to spring. Across the lot, Darla Pennington stood near the shelter's side entrance, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her crossed arms. Despite the early hour, she looked immaculate in her tailored blazer and pressed slacks. If she felt any nervousness about what was about to happen, it didn't show on her composed face. "Remember," Keaton whispered to Greer, "let them make the first move. We need clear evidence." Greer nodded, unable to find her voice. After weeks of gathering evidence, documenting patterns, and working with Keaton to build their case, everything hinged on the next few minutes. She thought of Juniper and her puppies, safely hidden away in a different facility, far from Darla's reach. The memory of their vulnerable faces strengthened her resolve. A white van turned into the parking lot, its headlights cutting through the morning haze. It moved slowly, deliberately, before coming to a stop near where Darla waited. The driver's door opened, and a man in a transport jacket stepped out. He moved with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. "Right on schedule," Darla called out, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet morning air. "I have everything prepared for the transfer." Greer's fingers tightened around her own recording device. From their position, they had a clear view of both Darla and the transport man. Keaton held up his hand, signaling her to stay still. The transport man nodded to Darla. "Ready for pickup? Can you confirm the package details?" "Of course," Darla replied smoothly. "Special intake, marked for immediate transfer." "Follow me." They watched as Darla led the man toward the side entrance. Her heels clicked against the concrete, the sound echoing in the empty lot. The transport man followed, his boots making softer thuds. "The carrier is just inside," Darla was saying as she held the door open. Everything's been prepared according to protocol." The man paused at the threshold. "Confirming Y7B," he said clearly, using the coded phrase they had been waiting for. Greer's breath caught in her throat. There it was, the exact confirmation they needed. Keaton's hand tightened on her shoulder, and she knew this was the moment they had been working toward. "Now," Keaton whispered, already moving. They emerged from their hiding spot as Keaton's backup units appeared from various positions around the lot. The transport man barely had time to turn before 2 officers had him secured. The look of shock on his face quickly morphed into resigned understanding. He'd been caught. Darla's composure cracked for the first time. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice sharp with indignation. "This is a legitimate rescue transfer." "Is it?" Keaton asked calmly, approaching with his badge visible. "Then you won't mind if we take a look at those transfer papers and that van." The search of the vehicle revealed exactly what they had suspected. Multiple identical carriers, each marked with similar codes, and a stack of forged rescue documentation. The evidence was overwhelming. Greer stood back, watching as Keaton directed his team. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. After so many weeks of uncertainty, of fighting against a system that seemed determined to ignore the truth, justice was finally being served. She watched as Darla was read her rights, the shelter director's usual poise completely shattered. The transport man was already in custody, providing information in exchange for consideration of his cooperation. "Miss Holston?" Keaton called, waving her over. "Would you verify these markings for us?" Greer approached the van, where officers were photographing the carriers and documents. Each carrier bore the same type of coded markings she had documented in her research. The forged papers showed a clear pattern of fake rescue transfers, all leading back to Voss's operation. "It's all here," she confirmed, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The same coding system we found in the old records." These carriers were meant for more than just Juniper's litter. Keaton nodded, making notes in his ever-present notepad. "This will connect directly to Voss. The transport man is already talking. Seems he doesn't want to take the fall alone." Relief washed over Greer in waves. Her persistence, her careful documentation, her refusal to look the other way. It had all led to this moment. The conspiracy that had used the shelter system to launder designer dogs was finally exposed. She thought of all the animals that had passed through this system, treated as commodities rather than living beings. Of Juniper, who had unknowingly helped expose it all. Of the countless others who would now be saved from the same fate. "You did good work here," Keaton said quietly, coming to stand beside her as they watched the evidence being catalogued and loaded into police vehicles. "Your attention to detail made this possible." Greer nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She watched as Darla was escorted to a waiting police car, the shelter director's head held high despite her circumstances. The transport man was already gone, taken to the station for formal questioning. The morning sun had burned away most of the mist now, casting bright light over the scene. Officers moved efficiently, documenting everything with photographs and careful notes. The white van stood open, its contents revealing the scope of the operation they had just shut down. In her pocket, Greer's phone buzzed with a message from Nico. "Juniper and Pup's all good." Safe and sound. Another wave of relief washed over her. Despite everything, they had protected the innocent lives at the heart of this case. "We'll need you to come down to the station," Keaton said, closing his notepad. "There's a lot of paperwork ahead, and we'll want your documentation properly filed." "Of course," Greer replied, finally finding her voice. "Whatever you need." As they walked toward Keaton's vehicle, Greer took one last look at the shelter building. For years, it had hidden dark secrets behind its mission of animal welfare. Now, in the bright morning light, those secrets were exposed, and change would finally come. The weight of weeks of worry and vigilance began to lift from her shoulders. Her detailed notes, her careful observations, her unwillingness to ignore what she saw. It had all mattered. Justice was being served, Not just for Juniper and her puppies, but for all the animals who had been treated as mere commodities in this scheme. The evidence they had gathered was overwhelming. The coded markings, the forged papers, the transport man's confession, and the physical proof in those identical carriers. The trail leading to Voss was clear and documented. Her persistence had been validated in the most concrete way possible. As she settled into the passenger seat of Keaton's vehicle, Greer felt a profound sense of peace. The morning's events played through her mind, Darla's confident facade crumbling, the transport man's resignation, the discovery of the forged documentation. It had all come together exactly as they had hoped. "Ready?" Keaton asked, starting the engine. Greer nodded, clutching her own documentation close. "Ready," she replied, knowing that while this chapter was closing, their work was far from over. But for now, she allowed herself to feel the satisfaction of knowing they had succeeded. The trap had worked, the evidence was secure, and justice was finally within reach. The peaceful morning shattered with the deafening crash of metal against metal. The entire building shuddered as a massive pickup truck slammed through the loading bay doors, crumpling them like paper. Behind the wheel sat Harlan Voss himself, his face contorted with rage. Greer stumbled backward as the truck's headlights pierced through the dim shelter hallway. Glass and debris scattered across the floor as Voss gunned the engine again, pushing further into the building. The acrid smell of burning rubber filled the air as his tires squealed against the concrete floor. "You think you can take everything from me?" Voss bellowed, emerging from the truck cab. His burly frame seemed to fill the doorway as he advanced, kicking aside fallen shelving. "Years of work, my whole operation, destroyed by some nobody shelter tech?" Greer's heart hammered in her chest as she backed away. "The police are already on their way," she warned, trying to keep her voice steady. But Voss just laughed, a harsh, dangerous sound. "They'll be too late," he snarled, reaching into his truck bed. He emerged with a large container, its warning labels clearly visible in the emergency lights. Without hesitation, he hurled it toward the nearest rack of cleaning supplies. The container burst on impact, chemicals splashing across the floor and shelves. Within seconds, flames erupted as the substances mixed, sending thick, toxic smoke billowing through the hallway. The fire spread with terrifying speed, feeding on the wooden shelving and plastic storage bins. "Let's see how heroic you feel now," Voss sneered, retreating toward his truck as the flames grew higher. Greer's eyes stung from the smoke as she ran toward the isolation room where Juniper and her puppies were housed. The chemical fire cast an eerie orange glow through the thickening haze. She could hear other animals barking and howling in panic throughout the shelter. Reaching the isolation room, she found the door already open. Juniper must have pushed through in her terror. The mother dog was nowhere in sight, but Greer spotted paw prints in the spilled chemicals leading toward the storage area. "Juniper!" she called out, coughing as the smoke burned her lungs. The storage area was a maze of tall metal racks filled with supplies, food, and equipment. The flames were spreading rapidly now, causing the metal to groan and buckle from the intense heat. Through the chaos, she heard a frightened whimper. Dropping to her hands and knees where the air was clearer, Greer crawled forward. There, beneath a precariously leaning shelf, she spotted Juniper. The mother dog had her special pup clutched gently in her mouth, but they were trapped by fallen boxes and equipment. "It's okay, girl," Greer called softly, inching closer. "I'm coming to help you." The heat was becoming unbearable as she reached them. Above, the metal racks creaked ominously, threatening to collapse at any moment. Juniper's eyes were wide with fear, but she didn't move from her protective crouch over her pup. Greer's hands trembled as she assessed the situation. The shelf was moments away from giving out completely. If it fell, both Juniper and her pup would be crushed. Looking around frantically, she spotted a hydraulic jack that had fallen from a nearby maintenance cart. Her fingers burned as she grabbed the jack, positioning it beneath the buckling shelf. The metal was hot enough to blister her skin, but she forced herself to keep working. With trembling arms, she pumped the handle, slowly raising the shelf just enough to create an escape route. "Come on, Juniper," she urged between coughs, We have to go now." The mother dog hesitated for just a moment before darting forward, still carrying her precious pup. Greer heard the horrifying sound of metal giving way above them. With the last of her strength, she lunged forward, wrapping her arms around Juniper and rolling them both clear as the entire rack came crashing down. They landed hard on the concrete floor as a wave of heat and smoke washed over them. Greer's back and arms were covered in burns, her lungs screaming for clean air. But Juniper was safe beside her, the special pup still secure in her gentle grip. Keeping low, Greer began guiding them toward the exit. The smoke was so thick now she could barely see a few feet ahead. Her eyes streamed tears as she crawled forward, one hand on Juniper's back to keep them together. Each movement was agony against her burned skin. Behind them, more shelves were collapsing as the fire consumed the storage area. The sound of sirens pierced through the chaos. Help was finally arriving. But they still had to make it out alive. The heat pressed in around them as they navigated through the burning building. Greer's vision was starting to blur, her lungs desperate for oxygen. But she couldn't stop. Juniper and her pup were depending on her. After everything they'd been through to expose Voss's operation, she couldn't let them die here in the flames. She could see faint daylight ahead now, streaming through the smoke where emergency responders had forced open doors. Just a little further. Her arms shook as she pushed forward, every muscle screaming in protest. Suddenly, strong hands grabbed her shoulders, pulling her the final few feet to safety. She heard voices shouting, felt the blessed coolness of fresh air on her face. Through her blurred vision, she saw Juniper and her pup being carefully lifted away by gentle hands. "Stay with us," a paramedic urged as they lifted her onto a stretcher. "You're going to be okay." Greer tried to focus on Juniper, needing to know the dogs were safe. Through the chaos of emergency vehicles and flashing lights, she glimpsed them being tended to by a veterinary team. The special pup was still securely with his mother, both of them alive thanks to her desperate rescue attempt. The shelter building behind them was now fully engulfed, black smoke pouring from every opening. But Voss's attempt at destruction had failed. The evidence was already documented, his operation exposed. And most importantly, Juniper and her remarkable pup had survived. As the paramedics began treating her burns and smoke inhalation, Greer finally allowed herself to rest. Her body was battered and in pain, but her spirit remained unbroken. She had faced the ultimate test of her resolve and emerged victorious, saving the very animals she had sworn to protect. The morning sun streamed through the shelter windows, casting long shadows across the debris-strewn floor. The acrid smell of smoke still lingered in the air, but the immediate danger had passed. Greer stood beside Deputy Keaton, clutching her weathered notebook in trembling hands. Before them, Darla Pennington sat in a metal folding chair, her usual impeccable appearance now disheveled, mascara smudged beneath her eyes. "Let's go through this one more time," Keaton said, his voice steady and professional. He placed the evidence bags on the table between them, printed transfer logs, kennel records, and photographs of the notched ears that had started it all. Darla's perfectly manicured nails drummed against the table. "I've already explained. Everything was done according to standard shelter protocols. These are legitimate rescue transfers." Greer stepped forward, opening her notebook. "That's not true, and you know it." Her voice was quiet but firm. "I've documented every suspicious transfer for the past 6 months. The pattern is clear." She laid out her meticulous notes, pointing to specific entries. "These Y7 alerts, they only appear for certain dogs, ones with specific characteristics, and always when Voss's operation is involved." "Coincidence?" Darla snapped, but her confidence was cracking. Keaton picked up one of the transfer logs. "These documents have been altered. The original intake numbers don't match the system records. We've confirmed this with the county database." "And the notches," Greer continued, spreading out photos of different dogs' ears. "They're not random injuries. They're a code, marking bloodlines, traits, breeding potential. I recognized it from my days in 4-H livestock shows." A bead of sweat rolled down Darla's temple. "You can't prove any connection to Voss." Actually, we can. Keaton produced a stack of papers. Your signature appears on every modified transfer. The transport driver we arrested has already given us a full statement, including details about your meetings with Voss to coordinate pickups. The shelter staff had gathered in the doorways and hallway, watching silently as their director's carefully constructed facade crumbled. Nico stood at the front, arms crossed, his usually friendly face hard with disappointment. You used us, he said, voice thick with emotion. We trusted you to protect these animals. Darla's shoulders slumped. You don't understand. The shelter needed funding. Voss offered a solution. By selling dogs into breeding operations? Greer's voice cracked with anger. Creating designer puppies through inbreeding? That's not a solution. It's abuse. A commotion at the front entrance drew their attention. 2 deputies led in a handcuffed Harlan Voss, his imposing frame diminished by defeat. His eyes locked with Darla's, and something unspoken passed between them. Miss Pennington, Keaton said formally, standing. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, falsifying government documents, and participation in an illegal breeding operation. He read her rights as he helped her to her feet. Greer watched as both Voss and Darla were led away, their footsteps echoing in the hushed shelter. The staff began to whisper among themselves, processing the magnitude of what had happened. Margot, the night janitor, appeared at Greer's side. You did good, kid. Those old records I gave you, they helped. Greer nodded, grateful for the woman's earlier help. They were the missing piece. Showed how long this had been going on, how deep it went. In the medical wing, Juniper and her puppies slept peacefully, unaware of the human drama that had swirled around them. The unusual pup, now named Ledger, for being the key piece of evidence, nursed contentedly alongside his siblings. Keaton returned, looking tired but satisfied. The district attorney is ready to proceed with charges. Between the physical evidence, documentation, and witness statements, they won't be able to wiggle out of this one. Greer closed her notebook, running her fingers over its worn cover. I almost can't believe it's over. Because of you, Keaton said firmly. Your attention to detail, your dedication to these animals, that's what brought them down. Not many people would have had the courage to stand up like you did. The shelter staff began to move around them, returning to their duties. But something had changed. There was a lightness in the air, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. The animals would be safer now, protected by people who truly cared about their welfare. One by one, staff members approached Greer, offering quiet thanks or supportive touches on her shoulder. Even those who had doubted her before now looked at her with respect. What happens now? Nico asked, voicing what everyone was wondering. The county will appoint an interim director. Keaton explained, someone with a proven track record of ethical shelter management, and will be implementing new oversight procedures to prevent anything like this from happening again. Greer looked around at the shelter, her shelter, where she had spent so many nights caring for abandoned and vulnerable animals. Despite the trauma of recent events, she felt a surge of hope. The truth had come to light, justice had been served, and most importantly, the animals were safe. The morning continued to unfold as police photographers documented evidence and official statements were taken. Through it all, Greer kept thinking about Juniper and her pups, knowing they would now have a chance at finding real, loving homes, not being sold into a cruel breeding system. Deputy Keaton gathered his files, preparing to leave for the station. The department will need your notes for the prosecution, he said to Greer, but we'll get them back to you. They're quite something. Might even want to keep them in the training materials as an example of proper documentation. Greer managed a small smile. Her exhaustive note-taking, once a source of teasing from co-workers, had proven to be the key to bringing down a corrupt operation. It wasn't flashy or dramatic, but sometimes justice came through in the smallest details, in the quiet persistence of doing what was right. The shelter would need time to heal, to rebuild trust and establish new leadership. But as Greer watched Keaton escort the last of the evidence boxes out, She knew that the worst was over. The truth had prevailed, and with it came the promise of a better future for all the animals in their care. Outside, the morning sun continued to rise, washing away the shadows of the night's events. Inside, the familiar sounds of the shelter, barking dogs, mewing cats, the rustle of food being prepared, created a comforting symphony of normalcy. Life would go on, but now with the assurance that those entrusted with caring for these vulnerable animals would truly honor that responsibility. The fall of Darla and Voss marked more than just the end of their corrupt operation. It represented a victory for every person who had ever stood up against wrongdoing, who had chosen to fight for what was right despite the personal cost. And for Greer, it was validation of her unwavering belief that every animal deserved protection, care, and a chance at a better life. The morning sun streamed through the shelter windows, casting warm rays across Greer's desk as she traced the pink scar that now marked her forearm. 3 weeks had passed since the fire, but the memories remained as vivid as the healing tissue. The mark didn't bother her, though. If anything, it reminded her of the strength she'd found within herself that night. "Morning, hero," called Nico, dropping off a fresh stack of intake forms. His greeting no longer carried the teasing tone it might have held before. Now it rang with genuine respect. "Just doing my job," Greer replied with a small smile, but she sat a little straighter in her chair. The whispers and sideways glances that had once made her feel invisible had transformed into warm greetings and earnest questions about her expertise. Even Dr. Martinez, the shelter veterinarian who'd barely acknowledged her existence before, now regularly sought her input on cases. The sound of clicking nails on linoleum drew her attention. Juniper trotted into view, her coat now glossy and well-groomed, a far cry from the matted, fearful stray who'd first arrived. The dog made a beeline for Greer's desk, followed by a wobbling ball of fluff, little Ledger, growing stronger every day. "There's my brave boy," Greer cooed, scooping up the puppy. His unique features, the split nose, double dew claws, and that telling notch in his ear, no longer marked him as evidence, but instead made him perfectly special. She'd named him Ledger, not just for his role in exposing the truth, but because every page of his life from now on would be filled with love instead of greed. Margot appeared in the doorway, arms crossed but smiling. "Your adoption paperwork's ready whenever you are, kiddo." The night janitor had become one of Greer's closest allies, her gruff exterior softening whenever Ledger attempted to chew her shoelaces. Greer's heart fluttered. Though Juniper and Ledger had been staying with her since the fire under emergency foster care, today would make it official. She'd spent weeks preparing her small apartment, puppy-proofing every corner and setting up cozy beds that the pair ignored in favor of sleeping on her own. The latest news report played quietly on the break room television as she passed. In ongoing developments, former shelter director Darla Pennington and breeding ring operator Harlan Voss face multiple felony charges. Sources say the investigation has expanded to 3 other states. Greer didn't need to hear more. Justice was taking its course. She found herself in the shelter's bright adoption room, sunlight warming the cheerful yellow walls. Deputy Keaton stood waiting, out of uniform for once, holding the official papers. Their eyes met, and his smile carried a warmth that had nothing to do with their professional victory. "Ready to make this official?" he asked, setting the documents on the table. His hand brushed hers as he passed her a pen. "More than ready," Greer answered, her voice steady and sure. This moment felt both huge and perfectly natural, like coming home after a long journey. She read each line carefully. Old habits died hard. But these weren't suspicious documents to decode. These papers would bind her legally to the 2 beings who'd already claimed her heart. Juniper pressed against her leg as she signed, while Ledger attempted to capture the pen's movement from his spot on her lap. When she reached the final line, "Adoptive parent's signature," Greer paused, taking in the magnitude of the moment. She was no longer just the night shift tech who noticed things others missed. She was someone who'd stood up for what was right, someone who'd risked everything to protect the vulnerable, someone worthy of this small family she'd found. She signed with confidence, her name bold and clear on the line. "Congratulations," Keaton said softly. "Though this just makes official what we've all known for weeks, they were yours from the start." He cleared his throat, suddenly seeming nervous. "Listen, I was thinking, would you like to get dinner sometime? To celebrate, I mean. Just the two of us?" The question hung in the air, full of possibility. Greer looked up at him, seeing not just the dedicated deputy who'd believed in her evidence, but a man who'd stood beside her through fire and fear, who'd seen her strength before she'd recognized it herself. "I'd like that," she replied, her smile genuine and warm. "Though you should know, I come with a bit of a package deal now." She gestured to Juniper and Ledger, who were playing with a squeaky toy in the corner. Keaton laughed. "I wouldn't have it any other way." They spent a few minutes playing with the dogs, discussing potential restaurants and times, the conversation flowing easily between them. The shelter bustled around them, staff members stopping by to congratulate Greer, volunteers cooing over Ledger's latest attempts at fierce growling, phones ringing with potential adopters asking about other animals. This place that had once felt like a battlefield now hummed with honest purpose. The remaining staff had rallied after Darla's arrest, committed to running things properly. Greer had been asked to help train new intake workers, sharing her eye for detail and instinct for catching red flags. Her meticulous nature, once mocked, was now a valued asset. As she gathered Juniper's leash and scooped up Ledger, Greer caught her reflection in the window. The tired, uncertain woman who'd once tried to blend into the background was gone. In her place stood someone who knew her worth, someone who'd earned every ounce of respect she received. The scar on her arm wasn't a mark of trauma, but a badge of courage, proof that doing the right thing might be frightening, might even be dangerous, but was always worth the risk. "Let's go home," she told her little family, and both dogs' tails wagged in happy agreement. Home, not just her apartment anymore, but a place where love and trust had replaced loneliness and doubt. She had dinner plans to look forward to, a job where she made a real difference, and two furry souls who'd helped her find her voice. As they walked through the shelter doors into the bright afternoon, Greer felt the last weights of her old life fall away. The underdog had indeed triumphed, but more importantly, she'd found where she belonged. Her steps were light as they headed to her car, Juniper trotting proudly beside her, Ledger snuggled in her arms, and the promise of dinner with Keaton warming her thoughts. This wasn't just an ending to the darkness they'd faced. It was the beginning of something bright and beautiful, a future built on courage, compassion, and the unshakable knowledge that sometimes the quietest voices speak the most important truths. Thanks for watching. If any part of this story lingered with you, consider subscribing. I'll be here again tomorrow, sharing another tale that speaks to the soul.